So I'm going to introduce a person where the rubber really does meet the road, or the pencil really meets the paper. Kody Chamberlain, who is an artist, and he works with me very closely on a book I'm writing. But I was impressed with Kody after doing a very comprehensive review of different artists around the country who are illustrators, because he conveyed an emotion and a depth to story that I was so impressed with. And so, Kody.
Oh yeah, and I have my my cheat sheet with my slides here. So. Okay. Can everybody hear me? Is the mic on?
I don't think it's on.
Mic check. Okay. I'll just try and talk loud if it's not on. Vic kind of gave an introduction, but I'm not a public speaker. I'm not a teacher, although I dabble a little bit in both. I am a full-time artist, and I sit quietly in my studio for hours at a time. So if I stumble over some words or say something that's a little bit skewed, please forgive me. Okay, so a quick intro and portfolio. You'll see recent credits, Warner Brothers, MTV, Image Comics, Universal Pictures, LucasArts, et cetera, et cetera. The book that Vic saw that I did was a Beowulf adaptation for HarperCollins. If anyone ever here read Beowulf? It's a very violent, gruesome story. We actually did a young reader adaptation of Beowulf for HarperCollins. And that was a big challenge because they wanted to stay away from blood and some of the gore. And the book is entirely blood and gore. So, but that was a fun, that's the book Vic saw that he liked the style for, that we would maybe use on his book, and ended up doing a sort of a version of that style. My background is design and advertising. I have a BFA in advertising from University of Louisiana in Lafayette, Louisiana. That's where the Cajuns are from, and I'm Cajun. I'm hiding my accent right now pretty well. Branding, I did a lot of branding. This was really my bread and butter, was logos, brochures, got into websites later, but this was really my specialty, was creating imagery for people. And I still do a little bit today. This is a cafe that actually me and Vic met at called America's, and I do all of his branding for free. I basically work for coffee because I like having him around. So my graphic design work these days is mostly charity or trade. From design and within design, I did a lot of illustration. And my background in design is one day I might be working on a poster for a skate shop to showcase a new product. The next day, an ad for a women's and children's hospital. So I had to be a chameleon in a way and adapt stylistically to a very specific look and feel for that client. And so every new client, every new day was a new look and basically a new me. I had to recreate myself as a creator. And that translated in my artwork. This is a card series I did for, this is the Indiana Jones series. These are actually hand-drawn trading cards that are shoved into the decks. They're called chase cards. Like George Lucas will sign a bunch of them, Spielberg, Harrison Ford. They also do photo cards, things like that. So these are specialty cards. I did 100 for the series. I got snuck into the decks, and honestly, most of them ended up on eBay, but it was a fun little project. I do a lot of work for MTV these days. I'm in with a few good producers there. This is a puppet show called Warren the Ape that they premiered. It's a comedy show. It's very similar to Triumph the Insult Dog. It's adult puppet comedy. And so they wanted to tease the show before the show came out, so we did a webcomic for their newsletter. And this comic actually went out to 35 million people in the MTV newsletter. And the guy on the right, anyone watch Jersey Shore? Come on, be honest. Terrible show. Okay, you shouldn't watch it. But this is a character on the show named Ronnie. They wanted to do an experiment where each of the characters on the show would be drawn as a superhero. I don't typically do superhero comics, but I can certainly work in that style. So they commissioned me to do one and a bunch of other people. I hadn't seen the show, but they sent me some YouTube clips. And the very first clip I opened with this guy, he was very built, very tan, and he was throwing a television through a window. And so I went Orange Hulk, and I'm told Ronnie actually has a poster of this hanging behind his desk. And if you're anything like me, you're wondering, why would Ronnie from Jersey Shore need a desk? I'm not sure. And that's just a joke. I'm sure Ronnie, I never met Ronnie. I'm sure he's a really cool guy. Watchmen, Tales of the Black Freighter. Watchmen is a graphic novel that came out originally in 1984 and 1985. The collected edition, the graphic novel version, is very well distributed. It's probably one of the most successful graphic novels ever created. And when it came time to make the film, it was so big, it was such a major project, they had to cut stuff out. So there's a biography of Hollis Mason that was cut out and done documentary style, faux documentary style. And the Tales of the Black Freighter, which was a comic within the comic, was pulled out and done as animation. And Warner Brothers had me come in and actually do conceptual artwork for that. So Conceptual artwork is when you take the screenplay, no imagery exists yet, there are no voice actors cast. It's what might this world look like if we animated it. So basically, I work directly from the script and with the director to create the early visuals for that. And it's only later that the animators then take this and recreate it in the final animation style. Really cool project. I also do quite a bit of storyboarding. This is a film called Whiskey Bay that just shot in Baton Rouge with Matt Dillon, Willem Dafoe, and a bunch of other people. And basically, this is it's very similar to comics, but I have to keep the camera movement in mind. I have to keep the actor, where the actor is going to be, the placement. And again, similar to conceptual art, working very closely with the director. I actually sat right with the director for about 2 months at his desk working on storyboards because he had a very specific vision for what he wanted to capture on film. So you can see it's very simple, it's very minimal. It's more about placement, a little bit of lighting, and it's really just trial and error before the actors and the cameras and the lights come out. That's very expensive. This is very cheap to do. So we can solve all of our problems in this stage, or the majority of the problems at this stage. When it comes time to direct, the director can focus on getting a good performance out of the actors and not so much about the world he's building around it because he already knows that world now because he's already seen it. My main home, 90% of everything I do is comics and graphic novels. This is a book called Sweets that came out recently. Although I've done a lot of work for Marvel, DC, some other major publishers, HarperCollins, this is my first fully owned, creator-owned work in that I own it completely and I did everything in the book, which is very unusual in comics these days. It's usually a team of 5 to 7 people that create a single comic book. I wrote the story, pencil, ink, lettering, coloring, even book design, logo, packaging, even the marketing for this. The only other person that touched my book was my editor, who was mostly proofreading. So this was a creative challenge for me to see if I can pull it off. And it's a murder mystery. It's about a spree killer and a New Orleans homicide detective that's trying to catch him. And here's one of the spreads from the book, the New Orleans Street Car. This is a comic I did with a country singer, Trace Adkins, which is very unusual. And I put this in here because one of the things I love about creating comics is finding a new audience. I'm from the South. I have a lot of country music fans in my family. They consume pop culture like nobody else. It's massive consumption of pop culture. Yet in the comic book world, there are really no books that cater to that audience. And so when Trace Adkins came to this publisher with this character idea, they pitched it to me to see if I wanted to illustrate it. I jumped on it right away because I knew there was an audience there, and that audience was not being served. This book ended up doing really, really well for us. Probably the best-selling book I've ever done was with a country singer on a character no one had ever heard of. And that's the same reason I chose to work with Vic on his story. He pitched me the idea. He was telling me about some of the research he was doing and some of the experimentation he was doing, a lot of it with Monty. And the project fascinated me, and I realized that, yes, this is a new audience I can reach with what I do. And that's something I'm always very excited about. This is a book called Punks the Comic. And I put this one in here because there's a lot of people that love comics. Maybe they like the idea of doing comics, but they can't draw. This book is done entirely in traditional photo collage. An old photocopier, X-Acto blade, and a glue stick. There is no drawing. There is no Photoshop except for the finished coloring. All the artwork is created black and white, and then I color digitally. But it's all hand done. I actually have the original boards with Scotch tape and glue hanging off of it. And this is the book I do for MTV. It's actually free if you want to read it. Go to MTV Comics and search Punks, and it'll come right up. You can read it for free. So a little bit of process junkie. So I'm going to try and maybe show you some tools if you have any interest in doing this type of work or adding any of this to the work you're doing, the presentations, any of this stuff. Here are some tools. The creative process, first thing I do is I collect my ideas. Some of them are bad, some of them are good. It doesn't matter. They all end up on index cards for me. And I have a giant cork wall that's about 12 foot by 12 foot. And I just plaster everything on this wall. And once I get a story idea for a comic, I then script it later. But my outlining is done entirely on index cards. And then, of course, you can see I work in screenplay format, which a lot of screenwriters or anyone that's dabbled with screenwriting software. And I use this format for two reasons. First, it pushes my dialogue into more of a center column so I can see what the balloon shape needs to be as I'm working on the panels. But it's also handy because we show a lot of comic work to producers in Los Angeles to try and get film and television series made or animation. And so this is a friendly format for that industry. My industry doesn't have a standard format. Every comic writer I've ever worked with has a different format, and so I could use any one I wanted, and so I chose one that was friendly to another industry. And then, of course, this is called a thumbnailing stage. In filmmaking, it will be called storyboarding. Same process. It's all about taking a story and working out the problems in advance before the pages are actually drawn. And here's a close-up there. I do work traditionally in pencil and ink, and so I pencil on the board, ink the board with brush and ink, so I actually dip the quills and stuff into the ink the old way. And the reason I do that is because there's a reseller market for the original artwork. There's another reason I'm going to talk about in a minute, but I can actually double my income on a page drawn by drawing it for a publisher and selling it to that publisher, and also selling the original to a fan that likes to collect it. So here you can see the original pencils, and then this is the same page, so I ink right on top of the pencils and then erase the pencils once it's done. And this is actually the same sequence here on the right. See the slide on the right? So that's basically the thumbnail for that sequence. And here's a bunch of just pages on the wall. So I always do my coloring digitally, although I can color by hand. Digital coloring, it also gives me an opportunity to correct any mistakes digitally, things like that. And I can draw, and I have drawn comics digitally completely, but I do still prefer analog for that. Of course, here's a spread from Vic's upcoming book that no one's seen yet. This is an introductory page. This is a pencil sketch for that. And then the painted colors, again, digital painted colors for that. And here's my workstation, just a plain old drawing table, and I keep my little tablet on the side and all my tools here. You can see the traditional jars of ink laying all around. Okay, so when you're working on a project and you're getting pretty far, how do you know when you're done? And I came up with this little saying: when you catch a butterfly, stop swinging the net. And so a lot of problems I see when people are creating artwork, or really anything, even fiction, if you over-polish, it becomes stale and flat. So once you have it and you capture it, it's time to stop, even if it's a little loose, even if it's a little sketchy. So when the project works, stop working. So creativity, I think, over time, as we get into our processes and we get into our industries and our fields, our creativity starts to slowly tank. We're no longer thinking up new ideas. We're not trying to solve problems. We're now just doing our jobs, we're making our money, and we're going home. But we can still keep creative work in our lives. So I put together a couple little tips here. So I say being creative saves time. And a lot of people think it doesn't. They think if they have to brainstorm a new idea, they're wasting time. If they have to experiment, they're wasting time. They need to get the work done now. But here's a very simple, and this is a lesson you can apply to anything, but it's a useful technique. The typeface you want to use is missing, right? That's a common thing. And you can think of a million problems just like this. The usual solution, find the typeface, right? So you're hunting, you're on flash drives, you're digging around on your old machine that you don't use anymore, you're trying to find this font. Here's a creative solution, is use a typeface you have handy. It seems like a limitation, but it's actually a creative challenge. Can you, especially if you're a graphic designer, can you do good work with the typography you have available versus searching for an old font? And what happens is all that time you wasted looking for a font, you've now created a better design and a newer design, and you were challenged by it, and therefore you're more creative because of it. And you probably save twice the amount of time you would have spent on it. So it seems like a limitation is actually a creative challenge. It's also an efficiency booster. So sequential art. So I'm a champion for sequential art. That's one of the reasons why I wanted to come do this. And it's not just comics, but here's the basics of how sequential art works. It's an egg on the table, it's an egg on the floor. And we know the egg fell. And the reason we know the egg fell is because we have memories. And so our memory adds a lot of context to the story. So scene 1, scene 2, our memory fills in everything else. That's why it's very powerful. Here's a very similar version by one of my favorite artists, Chris Ware. And you can see the superhero up on the building, and then the superheroes on the street, right? Same concept here. So it's a nice little, but also your mind fills in all these gaps, right? What happened to this guy? What's he about? Why did he jump off of this building? Was he delusional? Was he suicidal? And your mind starts racing. And that's a very, very powerful tool that I don't think gets used often enough. Sequential art really goes all the way back to the Lascaux Caves. There's scenery in the Lascaux Caves that show hunters sequentially killing the animals they're about to eat. And it can serve as, here's something interesting that happened, or it could serve as, here's something we can teach future generations about hunting. I don't think we really know the true purpose of it, but the sequences are there, and we can understand it. And I say this is probably the first recorded comic in history, which is also some of the first recorded art in history, which is very, very interesting. Here's another. So let's talk about symbols for a minute. A symbol, think about a swastika for a second, or a crucifix. Those little symbols, they're basically a suitcase that hold an incredible amount of information, right? So when you see a swastika anywhere, in any context, your mind fills in this little container with all these ideas. And that's the way language was arrived at. So all these little icons, these little logos, right, became symbols, became context. And when they're strung together, they begin to mean something. So comics are language. They're the actual origin of language. But today, comics are sort of frowned on. They're thought of as a kid's medium. And so there are two extremes, kid stuff or life and death, right? And that's really the only two times we see comics in everyday life. So let's talk about the Heimlich maneuver for a second. Your friend's choking right next to you, save their life. Here's how you do it. Pretty good description, right? Or would you rather see this in that situation? You instantly get the communication of this idea and how powerful it is and how automatic it is. Really, it probably took you a half a second to comprehend what just happened here versus this, which is very long. And I only show this because of the efficiency at which ideas can be communicated with sequential artwork. So one of the keys to it is simplicity. You can see these are very generic drawings. That's why a lot of sequential art is hand illustrated versus still photography laid together in a sequence. Because it's all about the idea. It's about communicating the idea in as efficient a way as possible. And a lot of times with the detail can become distracting. It becomes white noise. When you want to communicate something very quickly, go simple. If you want to expand on it a little bit, you can go as complex as you want. A lot of comic art specifically is very, very complex, and that's okay. But just be aware it does slow down the eye as you move through the sequences. So controlling the pace at which we view our images, really detail is the best way we do that. Less detail means they move very quickly. More detail means they move very slowly. So simplicity is the key. This is something interesting I found, a surgeon's knot, a 4 sequence of a surgeon's knot. Really, besides watching someone do it, imagine trying to learn this any other way. It wouldn't be very efficient at all. But this is a very efficient way to show the step-by-step on a surgeon's knot. Here's one of the first comics I ever did. It's about peeling crawfish. Again, I'm proudly Cajun. And I was hired while I was still in advertising to do a comic illustration to show the layman how to peel crawfish because this company, at the time, I'm not sure if they're still doing it, but they were shipping boiled crawfish all over the country. And so a lot of people had never even eaten crawfish before. And Monty actually reminded me of this yesterday, so I dug it up and stuck it in the slideshow. You can suck the head, sure, yeah. It's very good. So inventing, let's talk about inventing or problem solving, right? They're really the same thing. And Thomas Edison said to invent, you need a good imagination and a pile of junk. Now, what happens if you don't have a pile of junk? A lot of times if I'm redesigning a client logo, that's their pile of junk, and I get to work with that. But what if you're inventing an all-new story from nothing? What if you have to put together a slideshow presentation to put in front of people, and it doesn't yet exist? You don't have that pile of junk yet to work with. So I put together a little sequence of the way I like to track my thoughts and the way I like to create my properties. So the first thing is track your thoughts, and this seems blatantly obvious. It seems so painfully obvious. But believe me, when you sit down and you're in front of Keynote or whatever the Microsoft one is that I've never used, what's the Microsoft one? PowerPoint. When you're sitting down in front of PowerPoint and you're ready to create your presentation, all those great ideas you thought of, they're long gone. And you won't remember that you thought of them because you forgot them. And so that's one of the problems with forgetting things is you forgot them. And so track your thoughts. It's amazing how many times I have a little key that I use in my email to pull up all these things I sent myself, and I'm constantly surprised, oh, that's a great idea, and I sent myself, and I totally forgot about it. So again, I talked about my cork wall. All my ideas end up on the cork wall, but a lot of times I'm in a car, I'm in a taxi or whatever I'm at. I'm in line at the bank, and I get a great idea. What happens? I always carry sketchbooks with me. I have 2 in my bag right now, sketchbooks and notebooks. I also email myself all the time. And I have a specific subject line I use for basically ideas. And it's a word sequence that I use, and I look it up. I have a built-in search, so I can always pull up a search of all my ideas that I've sent myself. And also I wanted to talk about the power of the pencil. So let's talk about that for a moment. Sketching is not a gift, and I want to be very clear on that. I started drawing when I was 18, and we talked about this a little bit last night with our group. But I sucked at drawing for about 15 years before I got good enough to ever even get something published. And from there, it took me even longer, about 8 years, to actually get paid to do it. So it is a process, but sketching is not necessarily meant for finished artwork or to show anyone. And so here's something very interesting that I found, and I'm not afraid to do, but a lot of creators are. Professionals rarely show their early work because it's often terrible. That might include an outline for a screenplay, right, or notes for a screenplay. Just horrendous, embarrassingly bad. But the result is the assumption that creators work without it, and it's simply not true. You'll see a great screenplay, you'll download the PDF, read it, and it's brilliant, and it's amazing, right? But did you see the first 12 drafts of that screenplay that were just trash and unreadable, and there were chunks in it, and there were scene holders that made no sense? No one likes to show that stuff. No one ever publishes it. And so the world begins to think that we go without it, and that's not true. So when I talk about sketchbooks, this is what I like people to think happens in my sketchbook. Here's a friend of mine, kicked back with a cup of coffee. We took a cruise recently, and here's Roatan sitting on the deck. This is what I like people to think happens in the sketchbook. Here's what really happens. It's chicken scratch. It's me working an idea over and over and refining until I finally get something I can use. But it might be 30 pages of junk until I get that one image that I can then modify later and turn into something that's actually usable. So sketching is not about good drawing. It's about good thinking your way through problems. And that includes note-taking. I did this presentation at the How Design Conference in Boston, a much longer version. And afterwards, a woman came up to me and said, "It's interesting that you said that because I'm not an artist, but when I was getting married," and this is my interpretation of what she told me. This is not her sketches. She said, "When I was getting married, there were a lot of people coming to the wedding, and I had my table seating chart. And she actually drew it out by hand, and she discovered there was a divorced couple sitting right next to each other at two different tables in her table layout. Now imagine if you had done this in a spreadsheet, you would have never spotted this problem. So when I talk about spotting problems, this is the example I'm talking about. And again, these are my sketches, not hers, but this was the concept she told me after the presentation, and I told her I was going to use it, and the next time I did it. So sketching is the tip of the idea iceberg. Now, here's something I really like, and I think Monty is going to like this one. Mike might also like it. Bad sketches by brilliant creators. Alfred Hitchcock, one of my all-time favorites. Steven Spielberg, Martin Scorsese. Arguably, three of the best directors to ever work in film. Three of my favorites, at least. Here's some hand-drawn storyboards by Alfred Hitchcock. Embarrassingly bad, right? These are horrendous. Hand-drawn storyboards by Steven Spielberg. Look at this bottom one. That is embarrassing. If he ever knew that I was showing you guys this, he would be really upset. So again, the illusion that creators create without this early conceptual work because they're afraid to show it. It took a lot of work for me to track all this stuff down. And Martin Scorsese. Here's some Martin Scorsese hand-drawn. He's not even using the right ratio. He's using like a television tube thing. Really, really bad drawings. So let's compare this for a second. This is Martin Scorsese's hand-drawn image of a storyboard, and there's the shot from Taxi Driver. Now, if you can't see that that idea is all there from that horrible sketch, I think it's pretty obvious. It's a very, very powerful sequence. And if you actually compare any of these storyboards that I just showed you to the finished film, it's amazing how on point they are. And even these storyboards, the final ones that got released that I was able to dig up, there were bad ones before that that didn't get out. So let's kind of quickly show you these again. These are great. Spielberg is probably my favorite. All right, I'm not immune to it either. This is an iPhone sketch I drew on a bumpy plane on the way to San Diego Comic-Con, and there's a finished cover that came from it. So as you can actually see the SketchUp icon here from the iPhone, the little dot button that shows up. But you can see the idea is entirely there. So the idea was good, the execution comes later. If you need, and a lot of you won't even need the execution. There's no reason that Martin Scorsese would need good drawings of his storyboards to shoot a film. He just needs the idea to be complete and solid. But if you like bad drawings, dig into patent drawings a little bit. There are some awesomely bad patent drawings. I love this guy with the chainsaw coming right at his head. And the guy with the table saw has no head at all. But these are fun if you get a chance. So here's Thomas Edison, one of our great inventors, right? And here are some bad drawings by him. These are great. No idea. Yeah, you see the little note there? Make good drawing. He was aware in his creative process that he was drawing badly. He was totally aware of it. And he made a note to remind himself to, at some point, make a good drawing of his bad drawings. But he wasn't trying to make a good drawing. He was trying to make a good idea, and he did. And that's the important part. So make good drawing. Once you have a good idea, you can always get help if you need it. So I already showed you some hand-drawn storyboards by Alfred Hitchcock, but here are some logos by Saul Bass. Again, my background is advertising and design, and Saul Bass is a god among designers. His brands are probably some of the most prominent brands you've ever seen, and anytime these logos get redesigned, they usually get worse. So Saul Bass is brilliant. Here's the shower scene from Psycho, Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho. Arguably one of the most memorable scenes in cinematic history, right? The shower scene in Psycho was actually storyboarded by Saul Bass, a logo designer. Very, very powerful. Because Alfred Hitchcock needed help on these drawings. It was a very complex scene. It was a very rhythmic scene. He needed help with it. So Saul Bass actually storyboarded Alfred Hitchcock's shower scene. The more you know. But the point of the story is we may not all be able to draw as great as Peter Paul Rubens, but we might be able to outdraw Hitchcock. And that's a pretty nice landmark to hit. Okay, pop culture philosophy, a couple quick notes. This is from the segment I did at the How Design Conference. I thought I'd throw it in here. Basically, creative lessons from pop culture. Bruce Lee, Jaws, and Dumbo the Flying Elephant. But first, Bob Ross. Anybody know Bob Ross? All right, I love Bob Ross. I was a huge fan of his. I used to play hooky to just sit at home and watch him paint. But Bob Ross had many things he did. He was a very interesting guy. But the one thing I picked up on while watching his show is the happy accident. And what would happen is Bob Ross would be painting. He painted wet on wet. And if anyone's ever painted before, that's an incredibly difficult technique. Most of us lay down a layer, let it dry, do another layer, let it dry. Bob Ross painted wet on wet, which meant the canvas never dried until he was done. It's very, very difficult. And he's underappreciated for that as being one of the best. But on occasion, because he was painting live on national television, he would make a mistake. And so, in filmmaking or even in reality TV, you might be able to cut what's obviously a mistake out, or cut around it, or present it in a way to where you may never see the mistake. Bob Ross couldn't do that. His shows were not pre-recorded. So what would happen is he would take that mistake. Let's say he turned to the camera and his palette scraped right across the canvas as it was wet, right? Now, you could try and touch it up. You can try and smear the paint around a little bit. But Bob Ross would sort of smile and turn to the camera, and he would say, a happy accident. And so the mistake he made, he would now use that as inspiration for something new. So that long scrape, he might turn it into a wooden dock that stretches out into the lake he just drew for a boat, right? And that's the type of thing he would do. He would use that accident to create something new he would have never thought of otherwise, and never thought of that placement for that thing. And so he used the accident to create an all-new thing. Now, here's something that's true. Computers don't make mistakes. If you put a mathematical equation into a computer, it will be correct. If you render a straight line on a computer, it will be perfectly straight. The types of mistakes that computers make, like crashes, are not really good for creativity. Now, computers and painting are not necessarily enemies. I exist in a world where I use both. I use analog and digital back and forth all day long. But there's always an exception. Pixar is amazing, and they create this beautiful animation using nothing but the Pixar render farm. Entirely computer-driven animation. So, there's always the exception. I'm sorry, I'm not sure what these are. These look like Pixar drawings. Okay, obviously that's a joke, but you can see even today, arguably, I don't think anyone would argue that Pixar has the greatest computer technology in the world. They still create their characters by hand. They still storyboard the entire film by hand on paper and pin it to the wall, the same way Disney did it so many years ago. Can anyone guess why Pixar still does that by hand, considering the crazy computer technology they have and the best 3D artists in the world? Bob Ross was right. That's exactly right. We want mistakes to happen in the creative process, especially in the early stages we want mistakes, not in the later stages. But when we're generating ideas, we want mistakes. We want random things to happen because great ideas are born from that. Penicillin was created by accident, right? It was a laboratory accident. Accidents can really give you brilliant ideas, and we encourage those in the creative process. So please do not try to eliminate random things and accidents from any creative process you're doing. It's very important. Okay, so a little more pop culture. Here's some quotes here. Bruce Lee, everyone like Bruce Lee? Whether or not you like his movies or his martial arts, Bruce Lee had some incredible philosophies on creativity and style. He was real big on style. So here's a quote I love. Use only that which works and take it from any place you find it. So there are a lot of traditions in martial arts that Bruce Lee ignored because his fighting style was about combat. It was about being efficient. And in the event that your life is in danger, you want to be as efficient and as strong as possible in that situation. It's not necessarily about the dance aspect that a lot of martial arts do employ. He was about the efficiency of it. You put water into a cup, it becomes a cup. You put it in a teapot, it becomes the teapot. Be water, my friend. And this is a great metaphor for style. If I'm drawing a horror comic, I'm going to use a certain look and a style. If I'm drawing Vic's comic about his life, I'm going to use a certain style. If I'm doing something like a crime story, I'm going to adapt my style again for that. If my setting changes, my style is probably going to change with the setting. So I try to do that as much as I can. I think it's very important, and it's very powerful if you're able to do that in what you do. Dumbo the flying elephant, right? This is a good one. The magic feather was just a gag. You can fly, right? The feather was a placebo. And I say inspiration is a placebo. You don't need it to create. So a lot of people that dabble in creativity, if they get the urge, they get the sensation to create, they go in and they open their stuff and they create, and it's awesome. And that happens to me too, and it's amazing, and I love it. And you can create twice as fast as any other human alive when you're inspired. But what happens when you're not inspired? What happens if you have to work on a presentation and it's due and you're just not feeling it? I just want you to be aware that inspiration is a placebo. You don't need it to do creative work. Use your fundamentals, use your discipline, butt in the chair, and just keep working until it's done. And it will get done, and when it's all said and done, you'll be very impressed with yourself that you completed it. But don't ever walk away from your creative work just because you're not in the mood. Stick with it, and you usually get in the zone very quickly, I find. Chuck Close put it more bluntly: inspiration is for amateurs. And there's Chuck Close there, famous painter. He's still around, still working. All right, Jaws. I love Jaws. My favorite horror movie ever. There's Brody and the shark, right? And he sort of looks up, and he says, "We're going to need a bigger boat." Everybody remember that line? And they say the line several times in the movie. But that line is really about capacity. It's about increasing your capacity before you hunt the shark, not after, right? And so here's an example, just from my life. Being a comic book artist, I wanted to draw comics for a living. I would do conventions, and I would talk with people, and I was generating comics at a pretty fast pace. And I would stand in line for portfolio reviews with other artists with the same goal as me. And I would look at their portfolios, and I was blown away. This stuff is 20 times better than anything I could ever do. And I felt humiliated. It's like, my stuff is terrible. And then I would ask the artist, how long did it take you to do these 5 pages? 3 or 4 years. So they're working almost an entire year on 1 page of artwork. Now, what happens if Marvel calls and hires that artist? They now have to go from working on 1 page a year to 1 page a day, right? Because that's the pace we work in comics. We pretty much illustrate 1 page a day, and if you're doing all the jobs as I do, I try to do at least 2 or 3 pages a week. That's a very fast pace for what I do, pencil, inks, and colors. But if most Marvel artists will only pencil a comic, a different artist will ink it. So they're spending that long a time, or even if it's 2 or 3 weeks on a page, which is still a lot, the capacity is not there for professional work. So if they ever get the call to do professional work, they're going to get hired, they're going to turn in subpar work because they don't have enough time, and they're going to get fired from the job. So you have to increase your capacity before you get that call from Marvel Comics. And the same thing is going to apply to your careers. Make sure your capacity is big enough to handle the thing you're about to do before you do it and not after. It's a very tricky thing to do, and the best way to figure it out is to talk to someone that's already doing it. And they'll give you the advice you're going to need. Now, another thing that I like to do is build a creative think tank. And this is really important. Strength in numbers. So I don't drink. I've never taken a sip of alcohol. But I started something called Drink and Draw, which was inspired by a similar thing that was going on in Los Angeles I would visit. And it's basically we sit around, we drink, we eat food, and we draw. That's it. We have rules. The first rule is if you show up, you must draw. This is sort of our version of Fight Club, right? Because we don't want people just hanging around and lounging around or doing whatever. If you show up, you must draw. It doesn't mean you need to draw well, but you must draw. And no actual work. And this is the key because this is our time to experiment. This is us going to the gym to get better as artists. And then the next day, the next morning, when we go back to work, hopefully we're a little better and we learn something. So it's our time for experimentation. And in the little brackets there you see, unless you're on an immovable deadline, if you absolutely have to work the night of Drink and Draw, we do it every Wednesday night without exception, unless it's a holiday. If you have to choose between working on a deadline and missing Drink and Draw, we'll give a little bit of leeway for the people that have harsh deadlines. But here's some of the examples of the stuff I've done at the Drink and Draw. There's a turtle I'm working on. There's a guy with some eyeballs from his nose. Just really, someone said 2.5 babies while we were, the average family has 2.5 babies. And so I wanted to do 0.5 baby to see what that would look like. So sometimes like someone will just say something in conversation and that'll create a theme for the night. These are some of the ideas. Anyway, one thing I wanted to point out about creating your little think tank, that's what Vic actually has with us for here. We sat around last night and this morning, and we'll probably do it again several more times before we all leave, but we're all think tanking on his project right now. And in the Drink and Draw, what I do is I'll bring in some comic pages I'm working on and say, what do you think? What do you think about this? And the key is that they're all professionals doing either what I'm doing or something similar to what I'm doing, and they can offer advice from a professional perspective. It's always easy to find sort of the fan reaction to what I'm doing, but from another professional, what's your opinion on that? And this is a very, very powerful thing to have, is the think tank. So if you don't already have one on whatever it is you're doing, please start one. It doesn't have to be anything that costs you money. The drink and draw is we just all go to one restaurant, we pay for our own meals, and we draw. And it doesn't cost anyone a dime. But if you can start one, please do. It'll be very helpful. And there's my email, there's my Twitter. And if anyone has any pressing questions, I'm here.